we're now into good afternoon phase, and what I'm going to do. There are two components to this. First of all, there are the questions you may have for our speakers, who are very kindly going to assist you, but also there's the feedback in relation to the ballot paper. And what I'm planning to do is to go from table to table, ask first, have you any questions, and secondly, what's the feedback? Now, we haven't a lot of time, so please, we're going to start with table one. So we'll start with table one. First of all, do you have any questions?
So I'm the facilitator for table number one. We have two questions at this table. The first question I'm going to ask on behalf of the citizens, and then one of the citizens would like to also ask a question.
All right.
So this question is for Dr. Rory Costello, and the question is in terms of the table and the pros and cons of options for dissolution. So one of the citizens noted that so there is a slight difference between Parliament can call early election by supermajority and early election only possible when the government is defeated. But the question is that not the same thing, basically Parliament deciding when to call the election? Not by supermajority, but that by majority.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, there's a slight distinction. So, Parliament calling an election by majority can be the situation if the government desires an election and the government is in control of majority in the Dáil, then they could so do. However, the other option is that an early election is only possible when the government is defeated, would mean that the government loses a vote of confidence. So that's a slightly different situation. But again, it would be a majority passing the vote. It would just depend on whether or not the government backed that motion.
Okay. Yes. Very good. Now, a member wants to ask a question. Yes, Linda.
Yeah, my name's Linda, from a member from Table 1. From the presentations earlier on this morning, I'm hearing two potentially opposing perspectives. If we move away from the flexible model, it seems to suggest that it's politically fairer because it addresses the imbalance of power that's seen to be vested in the Taoiseach. But it also gives us government cohesion and political or policy consistency, which would appear to me to be in citizens' interests. I'm just wondering what the panel think. If you were to recommend a model that best reflects citizens' interests, which model would you go with?
Yeah. They're not going to be influenced at all, don't worry. Will we start with Owen at the end there and we move along?
Well, in terms of citizens' interests, what is the model seeking to avoid? It's seeking to avoid opportunistic or unnecessary early general elections, and also seeking to avoid giving undue power or influence to the Taoiseach over and above everybody else. So what makes sense to me is to have some kind of moderate constraint on the power to trigger an early general election. What form that constraint should take, I don't think we need to get into that now, but my view is that there should be a moderate constraint.
And are you saying it's not there now?
Well, it's a relative. I would classify it. I'm not sure what Petra would say, but I would classify it as a relatively weak constraint. It's weak partly because of the limited circumstances in which it can be applied, because of the ambiguity surrounding those circumstances. It's also weak, I think, because of the culture of the Irish presidency. There are similar presidencies in other parliamentary systems where the president can have a more assertive role, especially in the process of government formation. There are lots of historical reasons, which we needn't get into, why in Ireland presidents have had a role which is greatly diminished, even by reference to the formal powers they have in the Constitution. It's partly to do, some would say, it's partly to do with the hangover from the Irish Free State and the role of the Governor-General in the Irish Free State Constitution, but it's difficult to anticipate scenarios in which the President in the current setup would be a key player in the process of government formation. That has much to do with the culture and the traditions of the presidency as it is to do with the formal text. It's partly for that reason why I would describe the current constraint as a relatively weak constraint.
I think citizens So the citizens' interest is one where you have a coherent government and that's able to govern in response to citizens' wishes. And I think it currently the current system facilitates government. It probably gives a slight advantage to governing parties. But I think I was struck by something Rory said earlier. You don't want to disincentivize people from getting involved in government. It's something that's important. There's also, I think, when we discuss this, an attitude as if elections are bad things. You know, we don't necessarily always want to have changes of government without an election, because the election is a chance for the nation to have a kind of conversation, and sometimes the government won't have a mandate, but an election will give that might give a government a mandate. So I don't think we should be thinking of or be of the opinion that early elections are necessarily bad. They resolve deadlock, and they mean that probably governments are a little more responsive to the people's needs. I mean, I was struck earlier on by the question about what's the problem that we're trying to solve here. I'm just not convinced that there is one.
I'm going to be slightly disappointing here and sit on the fence somewhat, because I think there are pros and cons on this issue. But you know, even more than that, I think it's important to recognise, as Petra outlined, there are countries that have, you know, well-functioning democracies where citizens are, happy with the democratic institutions that have all of these different types of arrangements in place. So I don't think it's going to radically change citizens' satisfaction with the system, whether you move to one of these systems or keep the same one that we have now. So I'm sitting on the fence.
All right. And Petra?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think the trade-off you identify is real. I think citizens have an interest in both things. I think citizens have an interest in a politically fair system, as well as government cohesion and political effectiveness. I would agree with Rory that if you recommend slightly more constraint on the Taoiseach, it's not going to change things in a radical way. I would also agree with Rory that, you know, we have a large number of democracies operating with governments that are significantly more constrained than your government currently is under the Irish Constitution, and they have perfectly functioning, cohesive governments and that are politically effective. I would say one thing, that there's a tendency to move away from the vast discretion that prime ministers and governments have to time elections. And so we've seen debates in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, and of course in the UK that change. So there is an awareness that political fairness is important. So if there's been change that's been discussed recently, it's been in the direction of constraining the government and the prime minister.
Very good. Are there any suggestions in relation to the ballot paper from Table 1? And keep it as brief as you can.
So just two suggestions from the citizens at this table. The first one is in relation to whether it be semi or fixed term, that there's an option to vote for 4 years. And then the second suggestion, to have an alternative, so obviously to have the option for fixed term Parliament, but have another option with that, to say fixed term with the role of a role of the President to be involved only in extreme circumstances. For example, collapse of government, failed government formation, or failure to pass budget.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Table 2 now. Any questions first of all?
Thank you, George. I'm the facilitator for Table 2. A citizen at this table had 4 questions for the panel, one of which has been dealt with from questions from the previous table. And this is directed at Petra. With fixed and semi-fixed terms, is there a danger that the final year is spent campaigning? The second question, which is related to that, should there be legislation to restrict the time for campaigning prior to an election? And the final question, does the method of voting, whether it's first past the post or proportional representation, have any influence on the decision to have term limits?
Yeah. I'm sure you know we have proportional representation here. Yeah.
Influence on term limits, on the decision to... On the decision to have term limits, was your question?
Yes.
Mhm. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. With fixed and semi-fixed terms, is the final year spent campaigning? So you make elections more predictable, or at least the elections that are not regular elections. Sorry, should start again. Okay, so in any political system, you can have regular elections. So you can have parliaments that go to full term, in which case you will just campaign for whatever amount of time. When elections are called early, they're less predictable, and so less time is spent campaigning. It's true. So the less time is spent campaigning, the more a government can surprise the opposition, which is something that Rory mentioned. And so with fixed and semi-fixed parliamentary terms, you're making elections more predictable. And so to that extent, you're having longer campaigns. I think that is correct. The second question that you asked is, should the time for campaigning be restricted? I'm not an expert on that question.
and
I'm
it's
really sorry.
I don't think it really is relevant to the issue we have been tasked with making recommendations on.
Okay.
Yeah.
And whether proportional or majoritarian electoral systems go together with fixed or semi-fixed parliamentary terms, there is no correlation. So we have systems like Denmark that has a proportional electoral system, and the UK with majoritarian electoral system, who have used fully flexible terms, and vice versa. We have majoritarian and proportional electoral systems in combination with semi-fixed terms.
Yeah, very good. And have you got any suggestions in relation to the ballot paper?
Yes, those the citizens here have a couple of suggestions. The first one is a question: the present system should be retained, yes or no?
Oh yeah.
The second question is that where the present system is retained, it should be expanded. The roles of the key stakeholders might.
Say again?
Where the present system is retained, look at the roles of the key stakeholders, that they may be changed. And the final one was that would actually change to a fixed or semi-fixed terms.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If there was a change, would it be fixed or semi-fixed? Yeah, I'm with you. Very good. We go to table 3 now.
Hello, I'm the facilitator for table number 3.
Yeah.
The citizens at table number 3 have no questions for the panel. However, they have 6 questions or suggestions for the ballot.
All right.
So the first suggested question is number 1, should the current parliamentary process remain the same, e.g. maintain the status quo? Number 2, should semi-fixed parliaments be introduced, yes or no?
Yeah.
Number 3, should fixed-term parliaments be introduced, yes or no? Number 4, for a fixed/semi-fixed parliament, should the term be option A, 4 years, option B, 5 years,
Yes.
or option C, 6 years?
Yes.
The fifth question is for the ballot is, where there is a semi-fixed parliament, in order for an early dissolution, what should be the percentage of TD votes towards early dissolution? Option A, simple majority. Option B, supermajority.
Yeah.
And the final suggested question for the ballot, for a semi-fixed parliament, for an early dissolution, should the decision to seek early dissolution be made by A, Taoiseach, or B, Cabinet?
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Have you got all of those? Yeah. Yeah. Now we're going to table 4.
Judge, we don't have any questions, but
Yeah.
one of our citizens has a suggestion for the ballot paper.
Very good.
So we've a suggestion for 2 questions on the ballot paper. Question 1, what is your preference? A, maximum term or period. B, fixed term. C, semi-fixed.
Yeah.
Question number 2, and this is it's a nuanced version of table 3's suggestion. In the cases of maximum term or semi-fixed term,
Yeah.
what is your preference? A, Taoiseach can call early election. B, government can call early election. Parliament can call early election. So this includes the case that, you know, we retain the maximum period, but we change who can actually call the election.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. Table 5. Any questions, first of all?
Yes, we have a number of questions, quite short though. In relation to Norway, and I think they're for Professor Schleiter, how long, in relation to Norway, how long has the system in Norway been in place? Has there ever been an instance where their parliament has been dissolved before its complete course? And are there structures in place to dissolve parliament? And if so, would that not make them a semi-fixed term? And also, is the United States a fixed term system? And we also have a few recommendations on the format of the ballot paper.
We'll deal with the questions first. Norway.
I'm sorry, so the system has been in place since 45, and I don't know how long it's been in place before 45. I'm really sorry, I should have looked that up, and I've been asked that question before. So possibly since before 45.
Yeah, but certainly since 45.
Certainly since 45. And the US has a fixed term system, absolutely. So congressional terms are fixed.
Yeah.
In relation to Norway also, has there ever been an instance where their parliament has been dissolved before its complete course?
Not that I know since 45.
It couldn't happen in effect, yeah.
And are there structures in place to dissolve parliament? And if so, would that not make them semi-fixed?
Not that I know, so it's a fixed term parliament.
And if if there were structures, would it then be a semi-fixed system?
Yes.
It would. Yeah. And now about your recommendations.
Very good.
You had a question in relation to the US.
I think that was answered.
Oh yeah, sorry.
In relation to the format of the ballot paper, our discussions said the first question should be, should there be a change, yes or no? Yeah. If yes, should there be a semi-fixed parliament or a fixed-term parliament or a fixed-term parliament? Yeah. If fixed, what should the term be? If semi-fixed, what should the term be and what constraints should there be? And they'd like to be presented with a number of options for constraints.
Very good, very good. Table 6. Any questions, first of all?
Thank you, Justice Foy. There's no questions at the table, but there is a point on the ballot paper that citizens would like to raise. So some of the citizens at this table highlight that they do not want to see a change in the current system and the 5-year maximum. However, they would like to see a change in the power of the Taoiseach to dissolve the Dáil, give an increased power to the Parliament, and they would like to see this addressed in the ballot paper.
Yeah, increased powers?
To Parliament.
To Parliament, yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Judge, no questions for the panel, and there was a couple of recommendations for the ballot paper, but they've been covered already.
All right, well then there's no need to go through them if they've been covered already.
Thank you.
Table 7. Oh, sorry, table 8.
Thank you, Judge. Again, they've been covered already. There's 2 specific recommendations that haven't been covered. Yeah. The consensus at table 8 is that a supermajority of 66% of Parliament that casts a vote as opposed to people who would be entitled to vote. That's a distinction.
Say that again, who have actually voted.
Who have actually voted.
Yeah.
So to stop if one party abstains for something or something, so it stops that. The other recommendation is that in an instance where the President refuses to dissolve the Dáil, a 30-day time limit should be given to the caretaker to form a new government.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm the facilitator for table 9. One of the citizens at the table has a question, and the table has feedback on the ballot paper.
Yes. Well, we do the question first.
Hi there, John Long, citizen table 9.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting debate, and the way I pick it up with the trust has been that the current system of current system of calling elections would give too much power to the incumbent Taoiseach. However, taking out the 3 elections in 18 months in the early 80s, all 3 of which were brought down by opposition votes, plus the fact that almost all coalitions have either gone their full term or been collapsed by the junior partner. Taking those into account, 9 of the other 12 Dáils have gone 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So in almost no case, very rarely, has the Taoiseach ever used his prerogative in calling an early election.
Yeah.
So, now, my grandmother had a great saying, don't fix it unless it's broken.
Right.
So my question is, what is so fundamentally flawed with the current system that we have to fix it?
Yeah. Well, I think Owen O'Malley might be the person to answer.
I think I might agree with your grandmother in that I don't see that there is any fundamental flaw in the current system, and you're right. So a lot of the discussion has been about the power that the Taoiseach has, but in fact that power, as I hope I got across in my talk, is really quite constrained by circumstances, and so he's not always as powerful as we might think the Constitution sets out.
Yeah. Well, lest I be accused of being lacking objectivity, what do you think, Rory?
I mean, certainly there's no fundamental flaw with the current system. We're talking about, tinkering around the edges is really what this debate is about. It's not a fundamental issue, and I don't think that it is, I wouldn't see, an extremely pressing need to change either, although you could, as I kind of made out in my presentation, you could make the case that there are some marginal benefits for modifications, but I certainly wouldn't describe it as a pressing need.
Yes, very good. Yeah. Anybody else want? Owen, do you want to?
Just a very brief point. Thanks for the question. It's a point very well made. However, just one note of caution. I think you point to the fact that there have been very few early general elections. So I wouldn't assume that because the Taoiseach hasn't often called snap elections that means the power has no relevance. It might have been mentioned in some of the papers that a power like that can have an effect on the balance of power in the political system even where it's never used. The implicit threat of its use enhances the authority of the Taoiseach even if he never actually calls early general elections. The problem is, and bearing in mind that I'm not a political scientist, so the others might contradict me, but the problem is that it's very difficult to measure or quantify the level of enhanced authority or influence the Taoiseach has because of this power. But it is, if you look at the text of the Constitution, it doesn't say an awful lot about the power and the role of the Taoiseach. A lot of the power he has is soft power. Where does that come from? It comes from, say, his power to dismiss ministers, for example, but also, to some extent, his power to control the timing of general elections. They are probably the two major factors that enhance the authority of the Taoiseach, and it depends on whether enhancing the authority of a Prime Minister is considered a good thing. It is to some degree because of the imperatives of leadership, but only to a certain degree. My only problem is that it's difficult to prove or to measure just how much empowerment the Taoiseach has derived from the fact of possessing that power specifically.
Yeah. Petra, the outside perspective, have you a view?
Okay, the outside perspective, and I'm not an expert on Irish politics in any way or form, would simply be to say that even when Prime Ministers go to regular elections, that is when they choose to serve their full term, that too is a political choice. When the Prime Minister has the power to call an early election, then that too is a political choice, and it's a choice in partisan interest.
Thank you very much. Now, while we're on table 9, any suggestions in relation to the ballot paper?
The members at the table have several thoughts in relation to the ballot paper. If there are to be particular issues listed, they'd like them to be listed from least disruptive to most disruptive. The first question should be whether or not to enact any change at all.
Yes.
Thereafter, choice between semi-fixed and fixed parliaments. They'd like a question as to who should have a say in calling an election, and in particular it was felt that given that coalitions are becoming more common and probably will be more common into the future, that government parties should have, partners should have more of a say, and therefore they should be given the option of having the cabinet vote as well as the Taoiseach, so the Taoiseach should not have total power.
Yes, I'm with you. Then table 10. Any questions, first of all?
The table 10 have no questions,
yeah,
and they believe that their suggestions have been covered by other tables.
Very good.
So
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now we're moving on to table 11.
The citizens at this table have one question and then suggestions for the ballot,
yes.
and I'll pass it on to the citizen.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mike, table 11. Bearing in mind what happened in the UK, I was just wondering what the panel thought as regards what they thought, which happened in the UK, that the 2/3 parliamentary majority is enough to restrict the Prime Minister's powers.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I would defer to other speakers, the political scientists, really, but I think that based on what Petra said in her presentation, it would depend on the political dynamics at the time, and particularly how emboldened the opposition is, whether or not they feel they have to consent to an early general election being called. But I'm not an expert on that issue, so I won't say anything further.
It would also depend on just how many parties could make a difference to that majority. So if there are several parties that could make a difference to reaching that 2/3 majority, it can be a very, very significant constraint on the Prime Minister. So it depends on the nature of the party system as well as political circumstances at the time.
It also takes some of the snappiness out of a snap election, I suppose, might be one way of putting it, in that it takes some time to have passed that act. It alerts the rest of the political system to the real possibility or probability of an election. So while it might not prevent an early election, because it's very difficult to vote against an election if you're in opposition, it means that you've maybe some of that electoral advantage where you have a really quick election where you're kind of more or less on the doorsteps putting up posters that night, that's taken away.
Would it be usual to have a more super vote than 66%? Would that be unusual?
That would be quite unusual.
Unusual, yeah, very good. Now the questions from...
Sorry, I just had one other question, just a very quick one.
Yeah.
It hasn't been asked before. If they had an option to make changes themselves, what would they do?
Well, I think the response to Linda's question covered that, I think. Am I right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Table 12, please.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon.
There's 4 suggested ballot paper questions.
Yeah.
Question 1, should there be a change to the current system, yes or no? The second one is, should the Taoiseach's power be reduced or curbed, yes or no? Then the third question is, if yes, how? And there's 4 suggestions. A is government's decision, B is Parliament's decision, C is a supermajority of the Dáil only if called by the government, and D is a simple majority if called by the opposition. And the fourth question is, what should be the length of a fixed term, 4 or 5 years?
Yes, very good. Thank you very much. Now we're going to table 12. Any questions, first of all?
Yes, the citizens at table 12 have one question, and that is, what was the motivation to bring in the Fixed Term Parliament Act into the UK in 2011?
That's interesting.
It was a coalition negotiation between the Liberal Democrats, who were the minor coalition partner, and the Conservatives, who were the major coalition partner. And the concern was on the part of the minor coalition partner that the major coalition partner, the dominant coalition party, would call an early election as soon as it envisaged that it could win a majority. And so the minor coalition partner pressed for the Fixed Term Parliaments Act.
So it was politics.
And it was entirely politics, and there was a big deliberation over the parliamentary threshold that would be imposed to, that would be required for a dissolution of Parliament. Well, for the coalition, it worked.
The 2/3 majority didn't stop Theresa May calling a snap election. You know,
but
there was never a more snap election, I thought, than that one.
But that was not the government that enacted the change. That was the Cameron Clegg government that enacted the change, which actually lasted out its term.
A 2/3 majority won't stop a snap election, really, will it?
It depends on the
It can
makeup.
very well, yeah.
The makeup of the House.
I think you have a point in that it's very difficult for an opposition party to say we don't want to go to the country. So if a government says we want to call an election, it's going to be a very odd-looking opposition party that says no, we'd prefer to stay in opposition and you stay in power. So effectively, it's a kind of a meaningless threshold.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Did we get the suggestions from
ballot
table?
suggestions have been raised already.
Oh, that's very good. Now we'll go to 13.
The citizens of table 13 have one question, which one of the citizens would like to ask.
Yeah.
So at our last meeting we discussed citizens' initiatives and how they might be used in the context of referendums. So in the context of this meeting, if we had fixed or semi-fixed term parliaments, would a system where the people are an actor in the bringing about of a general election through a mechanism such as a recall election or otherwise like a super petition, would that be workable in Ireland? Would the people be able to be an actor in the dissolution of Parliament?
The people?
Yeah.
Well, they can only do that through an election, or am I misunderstanding it?
Well, I think what he means is, could you have a petition which asks which asks the Dáil to be dissolved? I suppose there's legally, I presume you could design a system such as that. It would be quite a radical change, and
be a bit like the Privy Council case.
It would be what number of votes or number of signatures would you allow? You couldn't have, say, 100,000 signatures. You allow 100,000 people to call an election. We'd continually have elections then.
Well, I suppose I was asking the question in the context of we had explored the other actors who could bring about the dissolution of Parliament, but only at that level. So that's, I suppose, the origin of the question.
Yeah, the other actors are elected, though. The Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, is elected. The government or cabinet is elected. Parliament is elected. And if the President had to say, he's elected. So they're all elected. Am I...
Could I say that a petition will always be a minority of the people? The only way in which you could gauge the views of the people as such, or the majority of the people, would be through a referendum, I suppose, and that would be a remarkably onerous way of deciding the calling of an early general election. So it would be technically possible to design such a system, but allowing to do it by petition would allow minorities to frequently call general elections, and that probably would be undesirable both from the point of view of stability, but also fairness as well, actually, because of the minority aspect.
Yeah, it's very good.
That would be my view.
Yeah. Are there any suggestions from table 13? Have been covered already. Thank you very much. And then the last table is table 14. Questions first and then suggestions.
The facilitator for table 14, this table has no questions.
Very good.
There are 2 recommendations.
Yes.
The first is, if there was a recommendation to have fixed term parliaments, could it also be recommended that cabinet ministers remain in their positions for the same fixed term? And second recommendation, they'd like a recommendation included that portfolios of cabinet ministers be relevant to their qualifications and experience.
I think that would present difficulties. Would anybody like to comment on that?
Well, is this on? I mean, in certain countries, ministers are appointed from outside of the Parliament, which increases the scope for appointing people who have relevant expertise. I mean, in the Irish case, there are a lot of constraints to consider when choosing people to give ministerial portfolios to. Typically there has to be a geographic balance, politically speaking, and a balance between the members of the government coalition partners, a gender balance. So if you're adding on to all of those constraints a match between their qualifications and the portfolio, it would leave very little or no choice in terms of the appointment of ministers. So I'm not sure if it would be a feasible option.
Does anybody else have an observation?
Just on fixed-term ministers, I'm not sure that it would address one issue which people sometimes say is that there's too high ministerial turnover, so they don't get into their job, into their brief, and then they're moved on, and so they can't develop expertise, and it loses consistency. On the data on Ireland doesn't have a huge problem with that Irish ministers are relatively stable. On whether you have some sort of qualifications, I think that would be a bad idea, because a lot of people have common sense, and one of the things that ministers should be is non-specialist, intelligent people with common sense, and I'm not sure how you can measure common sense in a qualification.
Petra, have you a view?
Can I comment on the government and whether governments or government ministers should have fixed terms? In a parliamentary system, that is impossible, because government serves only when it has the confidence of Parliament. So if a government loses the confidence of Parliament, it must step down. So you would not wish actually to fix the term of government ministers.
Well, I think the questions have been very good. The suggestions have been very good. We're going to consider it with the EAG over lunch, and I just, at this stage, just want to really express my sincere gratitude to our 4 speakers. I have to confess, I really didn't. I read the papers carefully. I really didn't get the question or didn't get the message until this morning, and it has been very helpful the way you presented matters. So I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you very much.